Hello, in this presentation we will talk about the employee section or a payroll section within QuickBooks Online. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here we are within the QuickBooks Online dashboard. We will be continuing with the Get Great Guitars problem. We're looking at the common cycles that we have here, now looking through the employee or payroll cycle. We're going to select this icon up top, the little plus icon, to see our common cycles. It's important to think of these things through cycles. Think of these processes, these normal items that we will be doing within the accounting process within cycles, because that allows us to think through and visualize, picture what the processes will be doing. We've taken a look at the customer cycle. That could also be the accounts receivable or sales cycle, the purchases cycle, or the vendors cycle, the expense cycle possibly, you can think of it as. And now we're looking at the employees cycle. So this is obviously going to be the payroll cycle. Before we go into this items here in QuickBooks Online, I want to take a quick look at the QuickBooks Desktop version in terms of the home page for a couple different reasons. One, we'll see that flow. We'll see the flow of how things will be input and what documents will be seen in a pictorial fashion. And two, if you're used to the QuickBooks Desktop version, then you may be used to that format and it'll be more familiar to you to kind of see that process, even if we don't need it necessarily, because once we can visualize that process, then we're just going to use these items and it's not necessary to have that visual processing anymore. But if we're just starting, and even if we've done this a few times, it's nice to have that visual component at first. So let's take a look at that now. So this is actually the desktop version, and we're just looking at the home page, and our goal here is just to get an idea of what these flows look like, what the forms that we will be filling in, what the data input will be processed through in terms of a flow chart. And we'll also just get a familiarity with the desktop version in terms of the flow chart, so that we can find those same items located in the online version. We've taken a look at the processes for the vendors, the payable section, the customer section, or the receivable or sales section. We're looking here at the employee section. Now, one reason it's nice to think about things in terms of these sections is this is really how you would be processing things through, and it's how basically you might be working if working in a larger accounting department within one of these particular areas of the accounting process. Payroll is in particular a very specialized field more and more, because payroll is becoming more and more complex to deal with, especially if we have different locations and whatnot. So there's a lot of different options. We'll talk more about those different options in terms of how to process payroll within QuickBooks. But no matter what the process for payroll is, we typically will have a nice little flow chart here, which will be, one, we're going to enter time in some way. Now, this time item we're not actually going to use in QuickBooks here, although it can be useful. What this will do is track it. It's kind of like, you can think of it as punching in a clock. So if we had someone that we wanted to track their time directly, it would be nice for them to just enter their time. This, I clocked in at 8 and then I left at 12 or whatnot, into this little section. And that can be automatically linked then to both the employee payment, helping us to generate their paycheck, and it can be linked to an invoice, helping us to take that time, record their billable hours, and create an invoice related to the time worked by employee. So that could be a really useful setup. Some companies will use it within QuickBooks. Sometimes if you have a more complex system, other companies will have a system outside of QuickBooks that'll track that time by employees and let different employees track that time. Some people might just ask their employees to fill out something like an Excel sheet telling us, how much time you work, how many times you spent on a particular client, and then enter that information into the system directly into the payroll processing. So we'll not deal with that here. This processing here isn't mandatory to process payroll, but it's one step that could be used to track time for employees that could then be used to process the payroll. Then we've got the pay employees. This is where we're actually going to process the payroll. So this happens depending on how often we pay employees. It could be weekly, it could be bi-weekly, it could be semi-monthly, it could be monthly. that we pay employees. And when that happens, when we're going to actually kind of generate the checks typically, we would select this icon and actually go through the process of recording if it was time here or salary-based employees, generate the checks. Those checks would generate the check as well as any withholdings we have that we then need to pay to anybody that we withheld for, including the government. So if we had taxes that we had to withhold for the government, or if we had other things that we had to withhold for 401k plans, for health insurance and that kind of stuff, then we would have taken that out here as well. And then we're going to pay the liabilities, and this will help us to not pay the paycheck, but now pay those liabilities. If we withhold money for federal withholding and state withholding, if we had our portion of the payroll taxes, then we have to track all that. And this will give us a nice little setup for us to pay that process here. So that's the normal kind of process we need for the employees. We need to enter the time somehow. We need to pay the employees based on the time if they're hourly or if they're salary. We need to process those paychecks and take the withholdings from the employees. Then we need to pay the liabilities, the amounts that we took from the employees, as well as our employer taxes to whoever we owe them to, including typically a government for payroll taxes. Let's take a look at some of these options in Payroll Online, and we'll just take a look at some of our options in terms of payroll. First, we'll take a look at this little plus icon up top, and you'll notice we looked at these by section, so it's similar to the home page in that we got customers, vendors, and employees. It doesn't give us that nice flow chart quite the same, but we have a similar processing. So here we're going to have some similar items. We have the similar time tracking feature where once again employees can put in that time. We can, if it's just us, we can track our time in here and say, hey, this is how much time we billed. And it's really nice to put that directly into QuickBooks if you can, because then it will be something that you can tie directly to payroll and or directly to invoices. And that's great. But if it's something, it's also possible for you to do it outside to track your time in your calendar or something like that, or in Excel or in some other, more fancy. There's a lot of softwares that are fairly fancy in terms of tracking different times and allowing different people to log in. So you may or may not use the time tracking, but it has its pros and cons like anything else, especially within the payroll process. And then we've got the payroll item here, and we've got this little item here saying, hey, do you want to purchase payroll? And there's different the reason payroll is a little bit more unusual, or a process that can cause problems, or something that you may want to think about and talk to an outside firm about, possibly most likely someone who you're not paying for payroll, because you want an unbiased opinion about how payroll, what's the best thing to do with payroll. And so I'm not saying that if you're looking for a payroll option to talk to a payroll company that does payroll, that's great. But obviously their opinion may be a little bit biased because they're trying to sell you a payroll service. QuickBooks is the same way, of course. They are going to try to sell you their payroll service and have you process things within the QuickBooks system, which may work well for you, and it may be something that you want to do outside. So if you select this payroll option, then it's going to go through, some of the items that you could do if you were to purchase payroll from Intuit, the owner of QuickBooks. And we'll look at this a little bit more later, but there's different types of payroll options. These would be type of add-on programs, so they would cost more. And if you get the higher version, then it'll do more of the processing. So just note, when you process payroll, you're gonna have it gets way more complex depending on how many employees you have, and if we have different states, then that's going to get more complex, or different regions, then that gets more complex, and we get to the decision as to whether we want to do this within QuickBooks or whether we want to have an outside CPA firm do the payroll. So our options are to process it in payroll here and pay the extra fee for QuickBooks to help us generate that payroll, or I'm going to close this back out. We could get to another third party to help us to process the payroll and then enter that information into the system. That doesn't mean that payroll's something we don't have to worry about anymore, because we still need to put those paychecks in the system so that we have the check there, we have the activity there, we can process our reports as well. But an outside firm like an ADP or Paychex could help us to make sure that we're up to date on the withholdings and any kind of legal payroll requirements that we have. So those are some of our options. The left-hand side over here, we have the workers So this is where we would set up our payroll. And whether we have payroll set up or not, we're in the employees section, workers, employees. We could set up our employees here and say here, here are the employees, and to set those up, we can add the employees here. And these would be, of course, part of the process for payroll to be set up. And payroll is another one of those items that really is not too difficult to run on a cycle-by-cycle basis to actually process the checks if everything is set up, meaning, and we'll go through this process, if the employees are set up, if we've entered the correct information from the W-4s, if we've got their wages set up, if we've got the withholdings and the time frame of when we process payroll in terms of weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, semi-monthly, all that set up correctly, the processing of payroll then becomes easier. But setting up that process can be complex, and understanding what the paycheck is actually doing in terms of these withholdings that we make will be a bit more complex. We'll take a look at those type of activities as we go through our problem.